The horse didn't move. It stood perfectly still at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets, its head lowered, while the lunch crowd surged past without a second glance. A brown mare, unremarkable in every way, hitched to a wagon that looked like 1,000 other delivery wagons, cluttering Manhattan's financial district that Thursday morning. Nobody paid attention. Why would they? It was September 16, 1920, and Wall Street hummed with the particular energy of American capitalism at its zenith. The Great War had ended 2 years prior, and the nation had emerged not just victorious, but wealthy beyond measure. European powers still counted their dead, while American banks counted their profits. The corner where the horse stood represented the beating heart of that prosperity, the intersection where the New York Stock Exchange, the J.P. Morgan Building, and the United States Assay Office formed a trinity of financial power unmatched anywhere on Earth. The morning had started like any Thursday. Clerks arrived at their desks by 8, their shoes clicking against marble floors that gleamed like mirrors. Typewriters began their staccato rhythm. Telephone operators connected calls that moved millions of dollars from one account to another, with voices so calm they might have been discussing the weather. Outside, messenger boys darted between buildings, carrying documents that could make or break fortunes. Street vendors hawked newspapers and hot dogs from carts that added their own smells to the September air. Grease and ink, and something that might have been roasted nuts. The temperature had climbed to 72 degrees by mid-morning. Not hot, but warm enough that men loosened their collars slightly when they thought nobody was watching. Women in their long skirts and button-up blouses moved more slowly, fanning themselves with folded newspapers. The sky held that particular September clarity, bright blue, with clouds so white they looked painted. Light bounced off the Morgan Building's limestone facade, off the brass fixtures of the stock exchange doors, off the glass windows that reflected the crowd back to itself. James Saul had worked as a clerk at the assay office for 6 years. He knew the rhythm of Wall Street like some men know their own heartbeat. He could tell time by the density of the crowd, by the types of people moving past his window. 11 o'clock brought the first wave of early lunchers, men who grabbed a quick sandwich so they could beat the noon rush. 11:30 brought the messengers, their final morning deliveries completed, heading toward their own cheap meals. Noon would bring everyone else, a flood of humanity that turned the intersection into a slow-moving river of dark suits and determination. At 11:45, Saul stood from his desk to stretch his legs. His eyes, more from habit than intention, scanned the street below. That's when he noticed the horse. Or rather, he noticed that the horse hadn't moved. How long had it been standing there? 10 minutes? 20? Delivery wagons didn't linger on Wall Street. They pulled up, unloaded, and moved on before a policeman could shoo them away. The financial district had no patience for obstacles. The wagon itself looked ordinary. Wooden sides, slightly weathered. Canvas tarp covering whatever cargo it carried. The driver's seat empty. Saul frowned. Where had the driver gone? You didn't leave a horse unattended in Manhattan. Not unless you wanted the animal stolen, or the wagon ticketed, or both. He almost said something to his supervisor, almost walked down to the street to investigate, but the clock on the wall showed 11:47, and he had correspondence to finish before lunch. Below, the crowd continued to thicken. A woman in a cream-colored dress emerged from the Morgan Building, glancing up and down the street as if looking for someone. 2 men in suits stood near the stock exchange entrance, deep in conversation, their hands moving to emphasize points invisible to anyone watching. A street sweeper pushed his cart along the curb, collecting the debris that accumulated by the hour in America's busiest financial district. Horse droppings, cigarette butts, discarded newspapers, the occasional lost glove or dropped coin. The Morgan Building rose above it all, 30 stories of limestone and steel, a monument to American banking power. J.P. Morgan himself wasn't there that day. He was in England, consulting with European financiers about war debts and reconstruction loans. His son, J.P. Morgan Jr., ran the family business now, but even he was traveling. The offices buzzed with activity anyway. Morgan bankers didn't need the boss present to move money around the globe. They did it by habit, by instinct, by the sheer momentum of institutional power. Inside those offices, telephones rang constantly. One floor up from street level, a secretary named Mary Herman typed a letter to a client in Boston. She was 24 years old, engaged to be married in November. Her fiancé worked at a law firm 3 blocks away. They met for lunch twice a week at a small Italian restaurant that served cheap pasta and cheaper wine, even though selling wine was illegal now. Prohibition had driven drinking underground but hadn't stopped it. Nothing stopped anything on Wall Street, least of all federal law. 2 floors above Mary, a junior partner named William Joyce reviewed loan applications. He was 41, married with 3 children, living in a brownstone in Brooklyn that he couldn't quite afford but maintained anyway because appearances mattered in banking. His eldest daughter wanted to attend college. His wife thought that was unnecessary for a girl. They argued about it most evenings, the same circular conversation that never reached conclusion. That morning, he'd kissed her goodbye without resolving anything, the same as every morning. The clock tower at the corner began its approach toward noon. Not the final hour yet, but close enough that people started glancing at their watches, calculating how much work they could finish before surrendering to hunger. The lunch decision was always the same but somehow required consideration anyway. The quick sandwich from the cart on the corner? The slightly nicer restaurant 2 blocks south? The really nice place that would cost a full day's wages for some of the younger clerks? At 11:55, a messenger boy named Tommy Moran wheeled his bicycle up to the Morgan Building. He had a package for the 3rd floor, something about bonds that needed signature confirmation. Tommy was 16, supporting his mother and 3 younger siblings since his father had died in France during the war. He made $14 a week renting messages, and he was grateful for it. The bicycle had cost him 6 months of savings. He parked it carefully, chaining it to a lamppost, and headed toward the Morgan entrance with his delivery. The horse still hadn't moved. Its head remained lowered, patient and still. If horses could look tired, this one looked exhausted. But nobody paid attention. Manhattan was full of tired horses, tired people, tired buildings bearing the weight of all that American ambition. The wagon it pulled sat low on its wheels, heavy with whatever cargo lay beneath the canvas. 100 pounds of dynamite. 500 pounds of cast-iron sash weights, cut into small pieces that would become shrapnel. A timer set to trigger at precisely 1 minute past noon. But nobody knew that. Nobody could have known it by looking. The wagon was just another wagon. The horse was just another horse. The corner was just another corner on just another Thursday in September, with nothing to distinguish it from any Thursday that had come before. James Saul returned to his desk. Mary Herman inserted a fresh sheet of paper into her typewriter. William Joyce made a note in the margin of a loan application. Tommy Moran climbed the stairs toward the 3rd floor, package tucked under his arm. The woman in the cream-colored dress gave up looking for whoever she'd been searching for, and walked back into the Morgan Building. The street sweeper moved south down Broad Street, his cart squeaking slightly on a wheel that needed oil. At 11:58, a broker named Edward Sweet exited the stock exchange. He just completed a transaction that would make his client very wealthy and himself moderately wealthy, and he was in the mood to celebrate with something better than a street vendor sandwich. He decided on the restaurant 2 blocks south, the one with the good roast beef. He walked north, away from the horse and wagon, toward Nassau Street. That decision would save his life. At 11:59, the crowd reached its density peak. Hundreds of people moved through the intersection, all with their own trajectories, their own lunch plans, their own small decisions about where to be and when to be there. Some walked quickly, eager to beat the rush. Others strolled, savoring these few minutes of freedom between morning labor and afternoon labor. A few stood still, engaged in conversations too important to postpone even for food. The horse lifted its head slightly, not much, just enough to shift its weight from one tired leg to another. Somewhere in the wagon behind it, a timer continued its inexorable countdown. Gears turned. Springs compressed. The mechanism was simple, reliable, impossible to stop once set in motion. Whoever had built it knew what they were doing. The bomb was not the work of an amateur. At noon exactly, the clock tower began to chime, deep, sonorous notes that cut through the noise of the street, marking the hour with the same authority it marked every hour, every day, every year. 1, 2, 3. The crowd began to thin slightly as people reached their destinations, disappeared into buildings, turned corners that took them out of the intersection. James Saul gathered his coat. Mary Herman saved her letter and stood to stretch. William Joyce closed the loan folder and placed it in his outbox. Tommy Moran descended the stairs, delivery completed, thinking about the cold chicken sandwich his mother had packed for his lunch. The woman in the cream-colored dress sat at her desk on the first floor of the Morgan building, disappointed that her husband hadn't shown up to take her to lunch as promised. 4, 5, 6. The clock continued counting. The horse lowered its head again. A breeze moved down Wall Street from the east, carrying the smell of the harbor, salt water and machine oil and dead fish. The breeze ruffled the canvas tarp on the wagon slightly. Beneath it, the timer reached its final seconds. 7, 8, 9. If these kinds of historical dominoes intrigue you, the small moments that toppled empires, the seconds before everything changed, hitting that like button helps us keep digging through the archives for more. Nobody in that intersection knew they were living in history. They thought they were just living, going to lunch, doing their jobs, making it through another Thursday in a long string of Thursdays that would stretch forward into an untroubled future. 10:11. The chime echoed off the stone buildings, off the marble facades, off the glass windows that reflected a moment of perfect ordinary peace. James Saul reached for his hat. Mary Herman applied fresh lipstick, checking her reflection in a compact mirror. William Joyce thought about his daughter and college, and whether his marriage could survive another year of the same arguments. Tommy Moran unlocked his bicycle. The clock struck 12:01. The wagon exploded. And everything that came after was darkness and smoke and screaming and a sound so loud it redefined what sound could be. But that comes next. For now, for one more second, the world was whole. The horse was alive. The people were alive. Wall Street stood intact, gleaming in the September sun, unaware that in one more breath, in one more heartbeat, in one more tick of that clock, it would learn what terror meant. The sound arrived before the understanding. Not a bang or a boom. Those words were too small, too contained for what happened when 100 pounds of dynamite detonated at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets. This was a sound that moved through bodies rather than around them, that compressed lungs and stopped hearts and shattered eardrums before the brain could register it as noise at all. Windows 12 blocks away exploded inward, sending glass through offices where people were eating lunch, reading newspapers, conducting business that had nothing to do with Wall Street. The blast wave traveled faster than thought, faster than reaction, faster than any possibility of escape. James Saul was reaching for his hat when his world turned white. The windows of the assay office blew in, and he was on the floor without understanding how he got there, his ears ringing with a frequency that felt like it might never stop. Above him, the ceiling had cracks he didn't remember seeing before. Plaster dust fell like snow. His hands were bleeding, though he couldn't feel pain yet. That would come later. For now, there was just confusion, just the desperate attempt to make his mind catch up with what his body had already experienced. Mary Herman's typewriter had been mid-keystroke. The explosion threw her backward, chair and all, into the filing cabinet behind her desk. The typewriter itself became a projectile, flying across the room and embedding in the wall opposite. She tried to breathe and couldn't. The air had been sucked out of her lungs, replaced with something that tasted like metal and fire. When her breath finally came back, it brought a scream with it, though she couldn't hear herself screaming. The ringing in her ears drowned out everything, including her own voice. William Joyce had been standing near his office window, looking down at the street, when the glass ceased being glass and became 1,000 knives. They tore through his suit jacket, his shirt, his skin. He fell forward, his hands instinctively covering his face, which meant the glass shredded his hands instead. He would survive, though he would never regain full use of his fingers. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking impossibly about his daughter, and whether he would live to see her graduate from college if she ever got to go. Tommy Moran was halfway down the stairs when the building shook. The stairwell saved him. The thick walls absorbed most of the blast's force, but the concussion wave still hit him hard enough to throw him against the wall, hard enough to break his wrist and crack 2 ribs. His bicycle, chained to the lamppost on the street, was vaporized. The lamppost itself bent at a 45-degree angle, as if some giant hand had casually swatted it aside. The woman in the cream-colored dress, whose name was Sarah Jackson, and who worked in the Morgan Building's ground-floor stenography pool, was blown across her desk and into the wall behind her. Her dress, that cream fabric she'd been so proud of, turned red in seconds. She would never wear cream again, assuming she survived to wear anything again. Later, she wouldn't remember the explosion itself, just the sudden transition from normal to nightmare, from Thursday morning to the end of the world. Outside, at ground zero, the devastation was absolute. The horse ceased to exist in any meaningful way. The wagon became splinters and smoke. The 500 pounds of cast-iron sash weights, carefully cut into small pieces, became shrapnel that traveled at speeds that made them deadlier than bullets. They tore through flesh and bone, through marble and limestone, through glass and steel and anything else that had the misfortune of being within their trajectory. A stenographer named Catherine Larkin had been walking past the wagon when it exploded. Later, witnesses would say she simply vanished in the blast. There was nothing to bury, nothing to send home to her family in Brooklyn. She was 22 years old. She had been planning to see a motion picture that evening with her sister. The sister waited at the theater for 2 hours before going home, before anyone thought to tell her what had happened, before anyone could tell her what had happened, because nobody yet knew who had lived and who had died, and who had simply ceased to exist. The J.P. Morgan Building's facade took the brunt of the blast. The limestone face, that symbol of permanence and power, cracked and crumbled. Chunks of stone the size of automobiles fell onto the street, crushing everything beneath them. The building's massive bronze doors blew inward, tearing off their hinges and flying through the lobby like some grotesque recreation of destruction. A guard named William Rooney was standing near those doors. He died before the doors finished falling. Smoke filled the intersection, thick and black and choking. It smelled of cordite and burning metal, and something sweeter, more terrible, burning flesh. People stumbled through it, blind and deaf and desperately trying to understand what had happened. Some thought it was an earthquake. Others thought a boiler had exploded. A few thought the stock exchange had been bombed, which was close to true but not quite right. Nobody yet understood that this was intentional, that someone had planned this, that someone had built that bomb and set that timer and walked away knowing exactly what would happen at 12:01. In the assay office, James Saul managed to stand. His legs worked, though they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. He moved to the window, or where the window had been. The frame was empty now, just jagged glass teeth around the edges. Below, the street had become something from a nightmare. Bodies lay scattered like discarded dolls. Some moved, writhing in pain. Others lay perfectly still. Between them, debris, chunks of stone, twisted metal, fragments of things that might have been wagon parts or building parts or human parts. A clerk from the exchange, his suit jacket torn and bloodied, knelt beside a man whose legs had been shattered. He was trying to help, but there was too much blood, and his hands kept slipping, and the man was screaming words that made no sense. Another person, Saul couldn't tell if it was a man or woman through the smoke, wandered in circles, calling out a name over and over. No one answered. Mary Herman forced herself to move. Her training as a stenographer had emphasized calm under pressure, though this hadn't been the kind of pressure anyone had in mind. She found a phone on a desk that still had a desk, and miraculously, it worked. When the operator answered, Mary surprised herself by speaking clearly, precisely, giving the address and the nature of the emergency. Bomb, explosion, many injured, send everyone. The operator's voice stayed calm too, that professional detachment that telephone operators cultivated. Ambulances were already being dispatched. Fire engines were en route. Help was coming, but help took time, and time was measured now in bleeding and dying and the desperate attempts of survivors to save people who might already be beyond saving. Office workers became impromptu medics, tearing their shirts into makeshift bandages, using their belts as tourniquets, doing what they could with no training and no supplies and no real understanding of whether anything they did mattered. Some of it mattered. Some people lived because a stranger pressed a jacket against a wound, because someone thought to elevate a leg, because another human being refused to let them slip away into shock and death. William Joyce made it down the stairs, his bleeding hands leaving prints on the walls. The Morgan lobby was chaos. The beautiful marble floors were slick with blood and water from burst pipes. The ceiling had partially collapsed, and dust still fell in sheets. He saw a woman sitting against the wall, her eyes open but seeing nothing. He saw a young man trying to stand on a leg that bent the wrong way. He saw a security guard kneeling beside what might have been another guard or might have been a visitor. There wasn't enough left to tell. Outside, the first policeman arrived. They'd been directing traffic 2 blocks away when the blast hit. Now they ran toward the smoke and the screaming, not knowing what they would find, not knowing if there might be a second bomb waiting. That fear, that this might be just the beginning, would become a constant companion in the hours ahead. Every unattended package, every stalled vehicle, every shadow that moved wrong, became a potential threat. The world had changed in an instant, and nobody yet understood all the ways it had changed. Tommy Moran stumbled out of the Morgan building, cradling his broken wrist. The street scene stopped him cold. He'd seen death before. His father's casket, closed because what the artillery had done wasn't something a family should see. But this was different. This was dozens of deaths, maybe hundreds, happening all at once, happening to people who'd been alive and walking and thinking about lunch just minutes before. A woman sat on the curb staring at her hands. They were covered in blood, but she wasn't bleeding. Whose blood was it? She seemed to be asking that question to no one in particular. 3 blocks away, a postal worker named John O'Brien found something strange. Actually, he found many strange things. The explosion had scattered debris across a wide radius. But this particular thing caught his attention. It was a piece of metal, twisted and blackened, with markings he didn't recognize. It looked like it might have come from the wagon, or from whatever had been in the wagon. He picked it up carefully, using his handkerchief, some instinct telling him this was evidence, this was important. Later, investigators would catalog it, photograph it, analyze it, and ultimately learn nothing useful from it. But O'Brien didn't know that. He carefully wrapped it and carried it toward the nearest police officer, feeling like he was helping, like this small piece of twisted metal might lead to answers. Sarah Jackson regained consciousness in the Morgan lobby, though she didn't remember losing consciousness. A man she didn't know was pressing something against her side. She tried to ask what was happening, but her voice didn't work right. The man, his own face cut and bleeding, told her to stay still, help was coming, she was going to be fine. He said it with such conviction that she almost believed him. But she could feel something warm spreading across her dress, and she knew that warm spreading feeling wasn't fine, wasn't going to be fine, might never be fine again. The first ambulance arrived at 12:14, 13 minutes after the explosion. The driver had navigated streets clogged with people fleeing the scene, with other vehicles driven by panicked drivers, with debris that made some streets impassable. The ambulance could hold 4 patients. There were dozens who needed immediate transport to hospitals. The driver and his assistant began making impossible choices. Who was most likely to survive? Who was most likely to die without immediate help? Who was already dead despite still breathing? These weren't choices anyone should have to make, but someone had to make them, and so they did. By 12:30, 5 ambulances were on scene. By 12:45, there were 10. Hospitals across Manhattan prepared for what was coming. Bellevue, St. Vincent's, New York Hospital. Every facility with an emergency ward cleared space, called in staff, readied operating rooms. Doctors who'd been eating lunch put down their sandwiches and ran. Nurses who'd been on break returned to their stations. The medical system of New York City mobilized with impressive speed, but even impressive speed wasn't fast enough for everyone who needed help. James Saul, his bleeding hands now wrapped in strips of curtain fabric, helped carry a wounded man to one of the ambulances. The man was unconscious, his breathing shallow and wet-sounding. Saul didn't know if he would make it to the hospital, didn't know if it mattered whether he made it or not. But carrying him felt better than standing still, felt better than looking at the carnage and doing nothing. So he carried, and when they loaded that man into the ambulance, he went back for another one. The smoke was beginning to clear, which somehow made things worse. In the smoke, you could pretend the scope of the damage was smaller than it was. You could imagine that once the air cleared, it wouldn't be so bad. But as visibility improved, the truth became undeniable. The intersection looked like a battlefield. The Morgan building's facade was pockmarked with hundreds of impact points where the shrapnel had struck. Some of those marks went deep, punching holes clean through the limestone. Others were shallow, surface scarring that would remain visible for decades. All of them were proof of how much force had been unleashed, how much metal had been flying through the air at speeds designed to kill. A reporter from the New York Tribune arrived at 12:40, notebook in hand, looking for the story. He'd been in the newspaper's offices when someone called in a report of an explosion on Wall Street. He'd expected something minor, maybe a gas leak or a small fire. He hadn't expected this. His first article, written on scene and telephoned back to the office, would describe it as, quote, "the worst disaster in New York's history." He would later revise that statement. But in that moment, with the smoke still hanging in the air and the screams still echoing off the buildings, it felt true. By 1 o'clock, the immediate crisis had passed in the sense that everyone who could be saved with basic first aid had been saved, and everyone who needed hospital care was either in an ambulance or waiting for one. The dead had been covered with whatever was available: jackets, tablecloths from nearby restaurants, canvas tarps. Nobody had done an official count yet. Nobody wanted to. Counting the dead would make it real in a way that even seeing them didn't quite accomplish. William Joyce sat on the steps of a building across the street from the blast site, watching investigators begin their work. His hands hurt now, the initial numbness giving way to pain that felt like fire. But he couldn't seem to make himself leave, couldn't seem to walk away from this place where he'd almost died, where dozens of others had died, where the simple act of going to lunch at the wrong time had been the difference between life and death. He thought about his daughter. He thought about college. He thought about all the arguments that suddenly seemed unimportant compared to being alive to have arguments at all. The investigators moved carefully through the debris field, photographing, measuring, collecting samples. They were looking for clues about what had caused this. Some of them already suspected the truth. This was no accident, no boiler explosion, no gas leak. This was a bomb, deliberately placed, precisely timed. But suspecting and proving were different things, and proving would require evidence, and evidence was scattered across 6 city blocks, mixed with blood and stone and the remnants of 38 people who would never go home. As the afternoon wore on, as the last of the wounded were transported to hospitals, as the covered bodies waited for the coroner's wagons, a different kind of shock settled over Manhattan. This wasn't just an attack on Wall Street. This was an attack on the idea of safety, on the assumption that American soil was inviolate, that the war was over and the danger had passed. Someone had brought war to the heart of American capitalism, and they had done it with terrifying efficiency. 38 dead, over 400 wounded, the financial district in ruins. And not a single suspect in custody, not a single lead, not even a clear understanding of who might want to do this and why. The sun moved west, and shadows grew long across Wall Street. The intersection, usually bustling with afternoon trading activity, stood eerily quiet, except for the investigators and the police and the people who came to stare at what remained. Tomorrow would bring questions. Tomorrow would bring demands for answers, for justice, for someone to pay for what had been done. But tomorrow was still hours away. For now, there was just the aftermath, just the reckoning with what had happened when the clock struck 12:01, just the terrible understanding that the world had changed, and nothing would ever quite feel safe again. William J. Flynn arrived at the scene at 3:30 that afternoon, stepping out of a black automobile with the kind of authority that made police officers stand straighter. He was the director of the Bureau of Investigation, the agency that would eventually become the FBI, but in 1920 was still finding its footing, still defining what federal law enforcement meant in a nation that had traditionally left policing to local authorities. Flynn was 53 years old, his hair going gray but his eyes sharp as ever. He'd built his reputation chasing anarchists, bombing suspects, revolutionaries who threatened the American order. And now, standing at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets, surveying the devastation, he believed he already knew who was responsible. The anarchists had done this. Flynn was certain of it before he examined a single piece of evidence, before he interviewed a single witness. before he did any of the methodical detective work that proper investigation required. He'd been hunting Italian anarchist groups for years, and in his mind, this attack bore all their signatures: the timing, lunch hour, maximum casualties. The target, the heart of capitalism, the Morgan building itself. The method, crude, but effective explosives. It had to be the followers of Luigi Galliani, that radical theorist who preached violent revolution and published bomb-making instructions in his newsletter. Had to be. This certainty would shape the investigation in ways that both helped and hindered the search for truth. Flynn's experience with anarchist tactics gave him insights that other investigators lacked. But his conviction that he already knew the answer meant he would see evidence through that lens, would follow leads that confirmed his theory while dismissing those that contradicted it. Good detective work requires doubt, requires the willingness to be wrong. Flynn had no such willingness. He knew who did this. Now he just had to prove it. The crime scene stretched across 6 city blocks, though the epicenter was obvious. The intersection itself looked like something from the Western Front. Cratered pavement, debris everywhere, the acrid smell of explosives still hanging in the air. Flynn walked slowly through it, his shoes crunching on broken glass, his eyes taking in details: the pattern of the blast damage, the way the Morgan building's facade had been torn apart, the depth of the crater in the street. This wasn't amateur hour. Whoever built this bomb knew what they were doing. His team began the systematic work of evidence collection. Every piece of metal, every fragment of wagon, every scrap that might have come from the bomb itself was photographed, cataloged, placed in labeled bags. They found horseshoes, 4 of them, blown clear of the explosion but identifiable by the scoring and heat damage. They found pieces of the wagon's undercarriage, charred but intact enough to suggest the wagon had been built locally, probably in the last year. They found fragments of what appeared to be a timing device, though the pieces were so small and damaged that reconstruction would be nearly impossible. The witnesses provided contradictory accounts, which was normal but frustrating. 3 people swore they'd seen a man jump from the wagon seconds before the explosion. 2 others said they'd seen the wagon sitting unattended for at least 10 minutes. One woman claimed she'd heard a ticking sound as she walked past, though how she could have heard anything over the noise of Wall Street at noon was questionable. A businessman insisted he'd seen 2 men in the wagon arguing. A messenger boy remembered seeing no one at all. Flynn interviewed dozens of people that first afternoon and evening. Each interview was carefully recorded, typed up by stenographers working in a makeshift command post set up in an undamaged office building 2 blocks from the blast site. Most witnesses had little useful information. They'd been too far away, or too focused on their own business, or too shocked by the explosion to remember details clearly. But patterns emerged from the chaos. Multiple people mentioned the horse looking tired, standing still for an unusual amount of time. Several remembered the wagon being parked awkwardly, blocking part of the intersection. A few noted that no driver had been visible, which was strange enough to register, but not strange enough to report before the explosion. By 6 that evening, Flynn had a working theory. A wagon, loaded with explosives and shrapnel, had been driven to Wall Street sometime between 11:30 and noon. The driver had set a timer, unhitched the horse or simply walked away, and disappeared into the crowd. The timing suggested the bomber knew the lunch rush patterns, knew when the intersection would be most crowded. The target, directly in front of the Morgan building, suggested this was about more than random terror. This was a message, a statement, an attack on the symbol of American financial power. But who would do such a thing? Flynn had a list of suspects before the sun set on September 16th. Every known anarchist in New York was on that list. Every follower of Galliani, every radical who'd been at meetings that bureau informants had infiltrated, every Italian immigrant who'd expressed anti-capitalist sentiments at any point in the past 5 years. The list ran to 300 names. Flynn intended to question every single one of them. The political pressure was immediate and intense. J.P. Morgan Jr., reached by telephone in England, demanded results. The Secretary of the Treasury called personally. The mayor of New York held a press conference and promised swift justice. Wall Street itself, that collection of powerful men who controlled much of the nation's wealth, wanted someone arrested, wanted someone punished, wanted assurance that this could never happen again. Flynn felt that pressure like a physical weight, but he also fed off it. He thrived on high-stakes cases, on being the man who solved the unsolvable. The forensic evidence, examined more carefully as the evening progressed, provided some clues. The explosive had been dynamite, probably the kind used in mining or construction. Not hard to acquire if you knew where to look. The shrapnel had been deliberately chosen. Sash weights, the kind used in window construction, cut into pieces small enough to maximize damage but large enough to penetrate deeply. Whoever built this bomb wanted to kill as many people as possible. The timer mechanism, reconstructed from fragments, appeared to be clockwork, simple, reliable, the kind of device that anyone with basic mechanical knowledge could assemble. By midnight, Flynn had set up a dedicated investigation headquarters in a requisitioned office building. Telephone lines were installed. Additional bureau agents were summoned from Washington, Boston, Philadelphia. Local police detectives were integrated into the team. Chemists and explosives experts were brought in to analyze the bomb components. The machinery of federal investigation ground into motion, impressive in its scope, but hampered by the limitations of 1920s technology. No fingerprint database to search, no security cameras to review, no cell phone records to trace, just witnesses, physical evidence, and shoe-leather detective work. The anarchist angle seemed more promising by the hour. At 2 a.m, a bureau agent working through mail collected from a postbox 5 blocks from the blast site made a discovery. 4 circulars printed on cheap paper shoved into the mailbox sometime before the explosion. The message was brief and threatening. "Remember, we will not tolerate any longer. Free the political prisoners, or it will be sure death for all of you. American anarchist fighters." The signature line was underlined 3 times, as if emphasis could make the threat more credible. Flynn examined the circulars carefully. The paper was standard, available at any stationery store. The printing was crude, probably done on a small hand press. The language was grammatically imperfect, suggesting a non-native English speaker. The timing was suspicious, placed in the mailbox before the bombing, clearly intended to be found afterward. This was a calling card, a claim of responsibility, or was it? Something about the circulars bothered Flynn, though he couldn't quite articulate what. They seemed too convenient, too obvious. Real anarchist communications tended to be more sophisticated in their rhetoric, more careful in their threats. These read like someone's idea of what anarchist propaganda should sound like. But Flynn had his narrative now, and evidence that supported the narrative was more valuable than doubts. He authorized raids on known anarchist meeting places across New York. By dawn on September 17th, police were breaking down doors in Little Italy, in the Lower East Side, in Brooklyn neighborhoods where Italian immigrants gathered. They arrested anyone who seemed suspicious, anyone who'd been overheard making anti-government statements, anyone whose name appeared in the Bureau's files of suspected radicals. By noon, they had 14 men in custody. The interrogations began immediately. Most of the suspects were terrified, confused about why they'd been arrested, insistent that they knew nothing about any bombing. A few were defiant, refusing to answer questions, demanding lawyers they couldn't afford. One man, a printer named Giuseppe, admitted to being an anarchist but denied any involvement in violence. Another, a dock worker called Tony, had an alibi. He'd been at work when the bombing occurred, witnessed by dozens of other dock workers. A third claimed he'd left the anarchist movement years ago, had settled down, had a wife and children now. Flynn pressed them anyway. Where were you on September 16th at noon? Who do you know who owns a wagon? Who do you know with explosives experience? Have you heard anyone talking about attacking Wall Street? The questions came in waves, hour after hour, wearing down resistance, looking for cracks in stories, searching for the one piece of information that would break the case open. By the end of the first day of interrogations, Flynn had nothing solid. Suspicions, yes. Theories, plenty. But evidence that would hold up in court? Nothing yet. The pressure to solve the case intensified. Newspapers ran headlines about anarchist terror and demanded action. Wall Street itself remained partially closed, with armed guards posted at every major bank and brokerage. The stock exchange opened with reduced hours and heavy security. Business leaders called for mass deportations of suspected radicals. Congress began drafting new laws to expand government surveillance powers. The bombing had created a crisis, and crises demanded responses, even if those responses didn't actually address the problem. By September 20th, 4 days after the explosion, the investigation had stalled. The 14 men in custody were either cleared and released or held on minor charges unrelated to the bombing. New leads had dried up. The horseshoes had been traced to dozens of possible blacksmiths. The wagon fragments suggested construction typical of hundreds of wagon makers across the Northeast. The dynamite was a common brand used in 1,000 legitimate applications. The timer mechanism could have been assembled by anyone with basic mechanical knowledge. Flynn ordered his agents to dig deeper into the anarchist networks. Informants were pressed for information. Known associates of suspected bombers were put under surveillance. The Bureau went through years of intercepted mail, looking for references to Wall Street or Morgan, or plans for attacks. They found plenty of revolutionary rhetoric, but nothing that specifically pointed to the September 16th bombing. The anarchists talked about revolution constantly. That was what anarchists did. But talking about revolution and building a bomb were different things, and Flynn needed evidence of the latter. A lead emerged in late September. A stable owner in Brooklyn came forward, nervous and reluctant, to report that a man matching a suspect's description had rented a horse and wagon in early September. The man had used a false name, paid in cash, and returned the horse but not the wagon. The stable owner had reported it as theft at the time, but hadn't connected it to the bombing until he saw a newspaper sketch of a suspect. Flynn's team descended on the stable, interviewing the owner repeatedly, trying to extract more details. What did the man look like? What was his accent? How did he behave? The stable owner's memory proved frustratingly vague. Dark hair, maybe. Average height, possibly. An accent, he thought, but couldn't place it. The sketch the stable owner helped create was circulated across New York. Hundreds of tips poured in. The man had been seen in Little Italy. No, in Brooklyn. Actually, in New Jersey. Or maybe Philadelphia. The tips led to dozens of interviews, all of them dead ends. The sketch could have been anyone, could have been no one. Without more specific identifying features, it was nearly useless. Flynn began to suspect that the bomber had fled the country. A thorough review of ship manifests from September 16th onward revealed that several known anarchists had departed from New York in the days following the attack. One in particular caught Flynn's attention. Mario Buda, a follower of Galliani, a man with explosives experience from his work in construction. A man who'd been in New York in mid-September and had sailed to Italy on September 19th, 3 days after the bombing. The timing was suspicious. The hasty departure was suspicious. Everything about Buddha screamed guilt, at least to Flynn. But suspicion wasn't evidence, and evidence was what Flynn needed. He cabled Italian authorities, requesting they detain and question Buddha. The Italians were cooperative, but ultimately unhelpful. By the time they located Buddha, weeks had passed, and he denied any involvement in the bombing. He claimed he'd left America because of increased persecution of anarchists, because staying would have meant eventual deportation anyway. As for the Wall Street attack, he knew nothing. The Italians had no grounds to hold him, no evidence connecting him to any crime. They let him go. By October, Flynn was publicly stating he would have the bombers in custody soon. Privately, he knew the trail was going cold. Physical evidence had been exhausted. Witness testimony had proven unreliable. Informants within anarchist circles had heard rumors but nothing concrete. The investigation was consuming enormous resources, dozens of agents, hundreds of work hours, significant political capital. And for all that effort, they had no arrests, no charges, no clear path to justice. The case that had seemed so solvable in those first hours after the explosion was revealing itself to be far more complex, far more frustrating than anyone had anticipated. Whoever planted that bomb on Wall Street had been careful, had been smart, had left almost no trace of their identity. And with each passing day, the chance of solving the case grew smaller, while the pressure to produce results only increased. Luigi Galleani never set foot on Wall Street on September 16, 1920. He wasn't even in the country. The Italian government had deported him back to Italy the previous year, ending his 2 decades of radical activism in America. But his ideas remained, circulating through the networks of Italian anarchists who had followed his teachings, who had read his newspaper Cronaca Sovversiva, who believed that violence against the capitalist state was not just justified but necessary. If Galleani didn't plant the bomb himself, Flynn was convinced his followers had done it in his name. The Galleanisti, as they were known, represented a particular strain of anarchist thought that made them especially concerning to law enforcement. They weren't just theorists discussing revolution in abstract terms. They believed in what Galleani called propaganda of the deed, direct action, violent action, designed to inspire others and strike fear into the ruling class. And they had already proven themselves willing to act on those beliefs. The question wasn't whether Galleanisti were capable of the Wall Street bombing. The question was which specific followers had carried it out. The history of Galleanist violence in America was well documented, at least from law enforcement's perspective. In 1919, they had orchestrated a coordinated bombing campaign that targeted judges, politicians, and business leaders across 8 cities. The most audacious attempt had been against Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer himself. A bomber had approached Palmer's home in Washington with a package full of dynamite. The device detonated prematurely, killing the bomber instantly and blowing out the front of Palmer's house. The Attorney General and his family survived, shaken but unharmed. The bomber's body was scattered across the neighborhood, but enough remained for identification. Carlo Valdinocci, a known Galleanist, a printer who had helped publish anarchist literature. That 1919 campaign had triggered what became known as the Palmer Raids, a massive crackdown on suspected radicals that saw thousands arrested, hundreds deported, and civil liberties trampled in the name of national security. The raids had been controversial, with many questioning whether the threat justified such extreme measures. But now, with Wall Street still smoldering and bodies still being identified, those questions seemed less pressing. The anarchists had struck again, bigger than before, deadlier than before. If anything, the Palmer raids hadn't gone far enough. Flynn's investigation into the Galleanist network revealed a tight-knit community of Italian immigrants, many working in construction or other manual labor, who gathered in social clubs and printing shops to discuss revolution. They published newspapers in Italian, distributed pamphlets, and maintained connections across multiple cities: Boston, Paterson, Newark, Philadelphia. Each city had its cell of believers, its collection of men who saw capitalism as a system that needed to be destroyed and were willing to use violence to destroy it. The Bureau's informants within these circles provided valuable intelligence but also frustrating limitations. The Gallianisti operated with considerable security consciousness. They used code words in their communications. They held important meetings in private locations with trusted members only. They were aware of surveillance and adapted their behavior accordingly. Getting solid intelligence on specific bombing plans was nearly impossible. The informants could report on general attitudes, on who seemed most militant, on which members possessed technical skills that could be used in bomb making. But specific knowledge of specific attacks, that information stayed locked within the innermost circles. Mario Buda emerged as Flynn's primary suspect through a combination of circumstantial evidence and educated guessing. Buda had been in America since 1907, working various construction jobs that gave him experience with explosives. He was a known Gallianist, had been arrested multiple times for distributing anarchist literature, and was friends with several prominent figures in the movement. Most importantly, his timeline was suspicious. He had been in New York in early September. He had attended anarchist meetings where the recent arrests of Sacco and Vanzetti were discussed with fury. And he had departed for Italy on September 19th, 3 days after the bombing, on a ship he'd booked passage on just days before the attack. The Sacco and Vanzetti connection was impossible to ignore. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, two Italian anarchists, had been arrested in May 1920 for a robbery and murder in Massachusetts. Their trial was becoming a cause célèbre in radical circles, with many believing they were being prosecuted not for their alleged crimes but for their political beliefs. The arrests had enraged the Gallianist community. Some saw it as yet another example of the American government's war on immigrants and radicals. Others saw it as an opportunity for retaliation. Had the Wall Street bombing been revenge for the Sacco and Vanzetti arrests? The timing suggested it might be. But proving the connection required more than suspicion and circumstantial evidence. Flynn needed someone to talk, needed an insider to provide testimony that could tie specific individuals to the specific act of building and planting that bomb. He authorized increased pressure on known Gallianists. Surveillance was intensified. Mail was intercepted. Informants were pushed to provide more detailed information. Some cracked under the pressure. A printer named Andrea Salcedo, arrested in connection with anarchist publications, jumped or fell from a 14th-floor window while in custody. His death sparked outrage in radical communities and raised uncomfortable questions about interrogation methods. It also failed to produce the confession Flynn needed. The deeper Flynn dug into the anarchist underworld, the more contradictions emerged. Yes, the Gallianists had motive. Yes, they had capability. Yes, they had a history of violence. But they also had alibis. Witnesses who placed suspected bombers far from Wall Street on September 16th. They had explanations for suspicious behavior that were plausible, even if not entirely convincing. And most frustratingly, they maintained a wall of silence that no amount of pressure seemed able to crack. Anarchists who freely admitted to wanting the overthrow of capitalism stopped talking when asked about specific violent acts. Their lawyers, often volunteers from progressive legal circles, knew how to protect their clients. Without physical evidence linking specific individuals to the bomb, Flynn's case remained theoretical. The story gets more complex here. The deeper Flynn digs into the anarchist underworld, the more contradictions emerge. Subscribe so you don't miss how conspiracy theories start to overtake facts. And if you have theories about who really did it, I want to hear them in the comments. By November 1920, Flynn had developed a detailed theory of the bombing. He believed Mario Buda, possibly with assistance from one or two other Galleanists, had built the bomb in a location outside the city, probably in New Jersey or Connecticut, where privacy was easier to maintain. They had transported it into Manhattan in the wagon, timing their arrival to coincide with the lunch rush. Buda had driven the wagon, set the timer, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. He had then left the country at the first opportunity, knowing that staying in America meant eventual capture. The bombing was revenge for Sacco and Vanzetti, a message to the capitalist class, and a demonstration that anarchists could strike at the heart of American power. It was a compelling theory. It explained the evidence, accounted for the suspicious timing of Buda's departure, and fit with what was known about Galleanist tactics. There was just one problem. Flynn couldn't prove any of it. The Italian authorities had questioned Buda and found nothing. No witnesses could place him in New York on September 16th. No physical evidence connected him to the bomb. His departure might have been coincidental, the natural result of increased persecution making America inhospitable for known anarchists. Without more, the theory remained speculation, educated but ultimately unprovable. Other suspects emerged and faded as the investigation continued. A Polish revolutionary group was investigated based on a tip that proved false. A disgruntled former Morgan employee was questioned extensively but had a solid alibi. A group of German immigrants, potentially seeking revenge for Germany's defeat in the war, were surveilled for weeks without producing any evidence of involvement. Each new lead consumed resources, generated hope, and ultimately led nowhere. The bombing was beginning to feel like the perfect crime, audacious enough to shock the nation but executed carefully enough to leave investigators grasping at shadows. The anarchist explanation satisfied certain needs even if it couldn't be definitively proven. It provided an enemy that the public could understand and fear. It justified the continued expansion of surveillance and security measures. It reinforced existing prejudices about immigrants and radicals. Wall Street wanted to believe that foreign agitators had attacked American prosperity. The government wanted to believe that enhanced law enforcement powers could prevent future attacks. The public wanted to believe that the bombers were fundamentally different from ordinary Americans, that this kind of violence came from outside, from ideologies alien to American values. But what if the anarchist theory was too convenient? What if Flynn's certainty had blinded him to other possibilities? A few investigators, quietly and without Flynn's blessing, pursued alternative theories. What if the target wasn't the Morgan building but something else nearby? What if the timing was coincidental rather than deliberate? What if the bomber had been killed in the blast, his identity vaporized, along with the horse and wagon? These questions were uncomfortable because they suggested the case might never be solved, that the bomber might have literally taken the secret to his grave, that justice might be impossible. By December, 3 months after the bombing, the investigation had reached a stalemate. Flynn maintained publicly that arrests were imminent. His private reports to Washington told a different story. The leads had dried up. The suspects had lawyered up or fled the country, and the physical evidence had been exhausted without producing definitive answers. The Bureau was still investigating, still following tips, still maintaining surveillance on suspected anarchists. But the intensity had diminished. Resources were being redirected to other cases. The bombing, while not forgotten, was becoming just one of many unsolved crimes demanding attention. The Galleanist community, for their part, never officially claimed responsibility for the Wall Street bombing. Individual anarchists would later hint at involvement, would reference the attack with knowing winks, would suggest that Mario Buda deserved credit even if proof was lacking, but no formal statement was ever issued, no manifesto claimed the deed, no one stepped forward to explain why Wall Street had been targeted, or what message the bombing was meant to convey. This silence was, in some ways, more effective than any communique could have been. It left authorities chasing ghosts, left the public uncertain, left the question of responsibility hanging unanswered in the air. Mario Buda himself would live another 43 years. He returned to Italy, continued his anarchist activism in quieter ways, and died in 1963 without ever admitting or denying involvement in the Wall Street bombing. In the 1950s, a historian interviewing elderly Italian anarchists reported hearing from multiple sources that Buda had indeed been responsible, that he had told friends the story over wine in private moments, that he had taken pride in striking such a blow against American capitalism. But these were second-hand accounts, impossible to verify, offered decades after the fact, when most witnesses were dead, and memories had been reshaped by time and ideology. The truth about the Wall Street bombing might have died with Buda, or it might have died in the explosion itself if the bomber was killed in the blast, or it might have been deliberately buried by anarchists who understood that admitting responsibility would bring down overwhelming government retaliation. Or perhaps the truth was more complicated than any single theory could capture, involving multiple people with different motivations, circumstances that converged accidentally into catastrophe, explanations that would satisfy neither the anarchist narrative nor the innocent victim narrative, but would somehow encompass both. What remained certain was that someone had built that bomb, had driven that wagon, had set that timer with full knowledge that dozens of people would die. Someone had decided that the lives of bank clerks and messengers and stenographers were acceptable costs in whatever larger struggle they imagined themselves fighting. Someone had turned an ordinary Thursday into tragedy, had scarred Wall Street both physically and psychologically, had demonstrated that even the most powerful institutions in America were vulnerable to a horse, a wagon, and 100 pounds of dynamite, and that someone, whoever they were, whatever their reasons, had gotten away with it. By October, Flynn had arrested 14 people. By December, he had released 13 of them. Nothing stuck. Each arrest had seemed promising. Each interrogation had suggested the breakthrough was imminent, and each release had been accompanied by quiet embarrassment and the nagging worry that the real bomber was still out there, watching, perhaps planning the next attack. The investigation was consuming resources at an unsustainable rate, and the returns were diminishing with each passing week. The case of Edwin Fisher illustrated the dangers of investigation driven by desperation rather than evidence. Fisher was a tennis star, well known in New York athletic circles, a man whose life revolved around country clubs and tournaments and the kind of leisurely prosperity that Wall Street symbolized. He had no connection to anarchism, no radical politics, no conceivable motive for bombing the financial district. But on the morning of September 16th, before the explosion, he had sent a bizarre telegram to a friend, warning that something terrible would happen on Wall Street. When investigators discovered the telegram days later, Fisher instantly became a suspect. The interrogations were intense. How did Fisher know about the bombing before it happened? His explanation was that he'd had a premonition, a feeling of impending doom that he couldn't explain but felt compelled to share. He claimed he often had such feelings, that he was sensitive to energies and vibrations that others couldn't perceive. To investigators trained to see patterns and conspiracies, this sounded like a cover story, like someone trying to hide guilty knowledge behind claims of psychic intuition. They pressed harder. Where was he on September 16th at noon? Playing tennis at a club in the Bronx, witnessed by a dozen people. Who did he know in anarchist circles? Nobody. Why Wall Street specifically? He didn't know, just had a feeling. Fisher's life unraveled under the weight of suspicion. His name appeared in newspapers as a person of interest in the bombing investigation. His tennis club asked him to resign. Friends stopped returning his calls. Business associates distanced themselves. His engagement was broken off. For weeks, he lived under surveillance, every movement watched, every conversation potentially incriminating. And through it all, he maintained his innocence, insisting that his only crime had been trying to warn someone about a premonition that had, terrifyingly, come true. Eventually, the Bureau had to admit there was no there. Fisher's alibi was unshakable. His premonition, however strange, didn't constitute evidence of involvement. His background revealed no connections to radical movements, no training in explosives, no motive beyond the supernatural intuition he claimed. They released him without charges, but the damage was done. Fisher's reputation never recovered. He would spend the rest of his life explaining, defending, trying to convince people that having a premonition didn't make him a terrorist. The Wall Street bombing had claimed 38 lives in the explosion. Fisher was a different kind of casualty, his life destroyed not by shrapnel but by suspicion. The Horseshoe investigation consumed thousands of work hours and produced exactly nothing useful. The 4 horseshoes found at the scene, blown clear of the explosion, seemed like they should be traceable. Blacksmiths left distinctive marks on their work. Each shoe was slightly different in shape and size, reflecting both the horse's hooves and the smith's technique. Flynn's team photographed the shoes from every angle, measured every dimension, cataloged every scratch and wear pattern. Then they began the tedious process of visiting every blacksmith in New York and the surrounding areas. The first problem was that there were hundreds of blacksmiths. Manhattan alone had over 50 shops doing horseshoeing. Add Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, New Jersey, and Connecticut, and the number grew into the hundreds. Each smith had to be interviewed, shown the photographs, asked if they recognized their own work. Most were cooperative but ultimately unhelpful. Yes, those could be their shoes. Or they could be from any of a dozen other smiths who worked in similar styles. The wear patterns suggested the horse had been working regularly, pulling wagons, which narrowed it down not at all because that described thousands of horses across the region. The second problem was that many horses were shoed by their owners, or by itinerant farriers who traveled between farms and didn't maintain shops or records. Tracing a horseshoe to a specific blacksmith might be possible with enough time and luck. Tracing it further to identify which horse had worn it, and then tracing that horse to its owner, and then connecting that owner to the bomber. The chain of evidence required was so long and tenuous that even Flynn had to admit it was unlikely to produce results. By January 1921, the horseshoe investigation was quietly shelved, filed away as a dead end that had consumed enormous resources without bringing them any closer to the bomber. The wagon presented similar frustrations. Fragments recovered from the scene suggested it had been a standard delivery wagon, the kind manufactured by dozens of companies and used by thousands of businesses. The wood was oak, common for wagon construction. The metal fittings were unremarkable. The wheels had been iron-rimmed, standard for the era. Nothing about the construction suggested custom work or distinctive features that could lead back to a specific builder or buyer. One promising lead emerged when investigators traced what they believed was a distinctive joint construction to a wagon maker in Brooklyn. The man confirmed he'd built wagons with that joint style, but he'd built hundreds of them over the years, selling them to customers whose names he rarely recorded. Another dead end. The stable lead had seemed more promising. The wagon had to come from somewhere, and stables kept records of rentals. Flynn's team visited every stable and livery in the greater New York area, showing photographs of the wagon fragments. asking about recent rentals, looking for any transaction that seemed suspicious. In late October, they found one. A stable owner in Brooklyn remembered renting a horse and wagon to a man who'd given the name Mike Smith and paid in cash. The man had been Italian or possibly Greek, had an accent the stable owner couldn't quite place, and had seemed nervous. He'd returned the horse several days later, but not the wagon, claiming it had broken down and he'd left it at a repair shop. The stable owner worked with a sketch artist to create a composite of Mike Smith. The result was generic enough to match thousands of men. Dark hair, medium height, working-class clothes, nothing distinctive. The sketch was circulated anyway, generating hundreds of tips. Mike Smith had been seen in Little Italy, no, in Hoboken. Actually, he looked like someone's cousin in Philadelphia. The tips multiplied faster than investigators could follow them, and every single one led nowhere. Mike Smith had either been extraordinarily lucky or extraordinarily careful, leaving no trail beyond that single stable transaction. The confession letter that arrived at the New York Times in mid-November seemed like a breakthrough. It was detailed, convincing, and completely false. The letter writer claimed to be one of 3 men who had planted the bomb, described the construction process in technical detail, explained the motive as revenge against Morgan for financing the war, and offered to surrender in exchange for guaranteed safety. The Times immediately contacted the Bureau, who descended on the newspaper offices to examine the letter. The details were impressive. The writer knew about dynamite, about timer construction, about the challenges of transporting explosives without detection. But as investigators dug deeper, contradictions emerged. The writer claimed they'd tested the timer mechanism at a location in New Jersey that, when checked, showed no evidence of explosive testing. He described purchasing dynamite from a supplier who, when interviewed, had sold no dynamite in the relevant time period. Most damningly, he claimed the bomb had been placed in the wagon at 6 in the morning, which contradicted witness testimony about when the wagon had first appeared on Wall Street. The Bureau traced the letter to an unemployed accountant named Harold Warren, who lived alone in a boarding house and spent his days reading newspapers and imagining himself important. The confession was fantasy, a desperate attempt at attention from a man whose life had become small and meaningless. Warren was arrested for obstruction of justice, served 6 months, and disappeared back into obscurity. But the investigation into his false confession had consumed 2 weeks of valuable time, had diverted resources from legitimate leads, and had demonstrated how easily the desire for answers could lead investigators astray. By spring 1921, the investigation had effectively stalled. The initial flood of tips and leads had slowed to a trickle. The dramatic arrests and interrogations had given way to desk work, reviewing files, comparing notes, looking for patterns that stubbornly refused to emerge. Flynn still maintained surveillance on known anarchists, still followed up on occasional tips, still held out hope that someone would crack and provide the testimony needed to make an arrest. But privately, he was beginning to accept that the case might never be solved. The political pressure had eased somewhat, not because anyone cared less about the bombing, but because attention had shifted to other crises. The economy was entering a recession. Labor strikes were erupting across the country. Prohibition enforcement was proving far more complicated than anticipated. The Wall Street bombing remained unsolved, but it was no longer the only crisis demanding government attention. Resources that had been dedicated exclusively to the investigation were redirected to other priorities. The few investigators still working the case full-time pursued increasingly desperate theories. What if the bombing hadn't been political at all but personal? What if someone had targeted a specific person who happened to work in the Morgan building, and the mass casualties were unintended collateral damage? This theory led to investigations into dozens of Morgan employees. looking for anyone who might have enemies, anyone involved in disputes or affairs, or financial troubles serious enough to justify murder. The investigations revealed affairs, embezzlements, and personal dramas of every variety, but nothing that connected to the bombing. Another theory suggested the bomb had been meant for the assay office rather than the Morgan building, perhaps placed by counterfeiters or gold thieves trying to destroy evidence or create chaos to enable a robbery. This led to investigations of recent gold shipments, counterfeiting cases, and criminal networks involved in precious metal theft. Again, the investigations revealed crime, but not the crime. The gold markets had their share of illegal activity, but none of it pointed toward September 16, 1920. A more exotic theory proposed that the bombing was connected to international politics, perhaps German agents seeking revenge for the war, or Soviet operatives trying to destabilize American capitalism, or even British intelligence attempting to create an incident that would justify increased security cooperation. These theories generated reams of speculation and very little evidence. German agents in America had been largely neutralized during the war. Soviet operatives were being watched closely by bureau agents. British intelligence had no conceivable motive for attacking American financial institutions. The international conspiracy theories were appealing in their complexity, but ultimately unsupported by facts. By the first anniversary of the bombing, September 16, 1921, the investigation had reached a point that no one wanted to formally acknowledge. The case wasn't officially closed. It would remain open technically for decades, but active investigation had essentially ceased. The files were stored in a warehouse, the evidence cataloged and preserved, the witness statements typed and filed. Flynn had moved on to other cases. Most of the agents who'd worked the investigation had been reassigned. The Wall Street bombing had become what everyone had feared it might become. A perfect crime, a mystery without solution, a tragedy without justice. The 38 people who died that day would never see their killer brought to trial. The hundreds who were injured would live with their scars and their questions. Wall Street would rebuild, would return to business, would eventually forget what it felt like when the ground shook and the sky filled with smoke, and the world learned that even the most powerful institutions in America could be vulnerable to a horse, a wagon, and 100 pounds of explosives. But the forgetting came later. In 1921, the wounds were still fresh, the questions still urgent, and the failure to solve the case still felt like a betrayal of everyone who had suffered. Justice delayed had become justice denied, and that denial would haunt American law enforcement for generations. Within 2 years, most Americans couldn't remember the bombing happened. Within a generation, it had vanished from textbooks. This wasn't gradual erosion of memory, or the natural fading that comes with time. This was active, almost willful forgetting, a collective decision that moving forward mattered more than remembering, that the nation needed to close this chapter rather than dwell on its unresolved horror. The question wasn't whether America would forget the worst terrorist attack in its history. The question was why the forgetting happened so quickly, so completely, so thoroughly, that by 1940 you could ask most Americans about Wall Street in 1920 and receive blank stares. The Roaring Twenties began with a bomb and ended with a crash, but the bomb was forgotten while the crash defined a generation. The economic boom that characterized the decade created a cultural amnesia, a deliberate turn away from violence and fear toward prosperity and pleasure. Jazz clubs opened where radical meeting halls had been raided. Speakeasies flourished despite prohibition, offering illegal alcohol but also something more valuable. Spaces where people could forget, could lose themselves in music and dancing and the hectic pursuit of good times. The bombing had reminded Americans of their vulnerability. The Roaring Twenties was about denying that vulnerability, about pretending the world was safe and fun and endlessly prosperous. Wall Street itself participated in the forgetting, though not entirely. J.P. Morgan Jr. made a decision that would prove more lasting than any memorial plaque. He refused to repair the building's facade. The pockmarks from the shrapnel remained. Hundreds of small scars where cast-iron fragments had punched into limestone. Some marks were deep, finger-length gouges that penetrated inches into the stone. Others were surface damage, shallow divots that caught rainwater and grew dark with grime. Morgan's stated reason was practical. The cost of repairs seemed unnecessary when the building remained structurally sound. But the decision carried symbolic weight. The scars would serve as a silent memorial, a permanent reminder of what had happened. Except memorials only work when people remember what they're memorializing. Within a few years, the pockmarks became just another feature of the building's facade, something tour guides might mention in passing if they mentioned it at all. New employees at Morgan would walk past the scarred stone daily without knowing why it was scarred, without understanding that each mark represented a fragment of metal that could have killed someone, that probably did kill someone, or wound someone, or traumatize someone. The memorial became invisible through familiarity, the way all familiar things become invisible over time. The survivors themselves often chose silence. Mary Herman, the stenographer who had been thrown across her office by the blast, never spoke about September 16th to her children. They learned about it only after her death. When sorting through her belongings, they found newspaper clippings carefully preserved in an envelope but never displayed, never discussed, kept private like some shameful secret rather than a tragedy she'd survived. When her daughter asked why Mary had never mentioned being in the bombing, a neighbor who'd known Mary for decades could only shrug. Some experiences were too large to speak about, too painful to revisit, too entangled with questions that had no answers. William Joyce, the junior partner who'd been cut by flying glass, developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. He couldn't work in tall buildings anymore. The sound of car backfires sent him into panic attacks. He left Morgan within a year, took a position at a smaller firm that operated from a 2-story building in Brooklyn, and never explained why he'd left such a prestigious position. His daughter did go to college eventually, though Joyce didn't live to see her graduate. He died of a heart attack in 1928, just 49 years old, his hands still bearing the scars from glass that had torn through them that Thursday afternoon. James Saul stayed at the assay office until it closed in 1933. He was there on Black Tuesday in 1929 when the stock market crashed, watching from the same window where he'd seen the horse and wagon 8 years earlier. The financial panic of 1929 affected far more people than the bombing had, reshaped the American economy in ways the explosion never could. But Saul sometimes wondered if they were connected somehow. Had the bombing wounded Wall Street in ways that went deeper than the physical damage? Had it created cracks in confidence that eventually widened into catastrophic failure? Or was that just the human need to find patterns, to connect events that were actually separate, to impose meaning on tragedies that had none? The media's role in the forgetting was both active and passive. Newspapers covered the bombing intensively for weeks, then months, and then hardly at all. By 1922, mentions of the Wall Street bombing appeared only in anniversary retrospectives, brief recountings of the facts alongside speculation about the unsolved nature of the case. By 1925, even the anniversary coverage had largely ceased. The bombing competed for attention with newer scandals, fresher tragedies, more recent crimes. News, by definition, is about what's new. An unsolved bombing from 5 years ago wasn't news anymore. It was history, and history was what you left behind to focus on the present. But here's what the history books don't tell you. While Congress debated immigration restrictions and prohibition enforcement publicly, a quieter transformation was happening in how America thought about security. The bombing had created a template for future responses to terrorism that would remain relevant for a century. Armed guards appeared at federal buildings. Barriers went up around sensitive facilities. Surveillance of immigrant communities intensified. The Bureau of Investigation expanded its powers and its budget. These changes happened gradually, incrementally, each step justified by the need to prevent another Wall Street, even as the memory of the actual Wall Street bombing faded. In 1944, as Allied forces fought across Europe and the Pacific, a priest in a small Italian village heard a confession that would haunt him for years. The man confessing was dying. His voice weak, his time clearly short. He told the priest about a bomb he'd built in America, about Wall Street, about 1920. He said he'd done it for the cause, for the workers, for all the people crushed under capitalism's boot. He said he'd never regretted it, even knowing the innocent people who died, because there were no innocent people among the ruling class. The priest listened, granted absolution as his office required, and said nothing until the man died 3 days later. Only then did the priest contact authorities, torn between the sanctity of confession and the enormity of what he'd heard. The man's name was Mario Buda. The Italian police investigated, found that Buda had indeed been in America in 1920, had indeed returned shortly after the bombing, but he was dead now. Beyond prosecution, beyond justice. The Americans were notified but showed limited interest. The war was on. Resources were dedicated to fighting fascism, not pursuing 24-year-old cold cases. And besides, what could they do? The suspect was dead. The evidence was decades old. The case would remain unsolved whether they pursued this lead or not. The confession, if it was genuine, raised as many questions as it answered. Had Buda acted alone or with accomplices? If there were others involved, had they died or were they still out there, living quiet lives, their terrible secret locked away? The confession mentioned the cause, but provided no specifics about whether the attack was coordinated with other Galleanists or was Buda's independent action. Most frustratingly, the confession offered no remorse, no second thoughts, no evolution in thinking that might make the senseless violence comprehensible. Buda died as he'd lived, a true believer, convinced that his actions were justified, that the ends had warranted the means. Flynn had died in 1928, worn down by years of chasing shadows and following leads that evaporated. He'd retired from the Bureau in 1924, frustrated by the Wall Street case and other investigations that had consumed his energy without providing the satisfying resolution that successful detective work required. In his later years, he'd maintained that the anarchists were responsible, that Mario Buda specifically had been the bomber, but he'd also admitted that proving it was impossible. The certainty of his early investigation had given way to resignation. Some cases remained unsolved, not because investigators were incompetent, but because the criminals were careful, lucky, or both. The bombing survivors who lived into old age carried their memories into a world that had largely forgotten. Sarah Jackson, the woman in the cream-colored dress, lived until 1983. In her final years, in a nursing home in New Jersey, she would sometimes tell stories about Wall Street to nurses who had no context for what she was describing. They knew about Pearl Harbor, about Kennedy's assassination, about Vietnam. But Wall Street in 1920? That was ancient history, something that might as well have happened during the Civil War for all the cultural relevance it maintained. Sarah would describe the sound of the explosion, the sight of smoke filling the air, the feeling of blood soaking through her dress. The nurses listened politely, marking it down as the rambling reminiscence of an old woman whose mind wandered through decades of memories without clear chronology. Tommy Moran, the messenger boy who'd broken his wrist in the stairwell, built a successful delivery business and never rode a bicycle again. He told his children about the bombing exactly once, when they were teenagers, and asked why he never learned to ride a bike like other fathers. He described being in the Morgan building, the explosion throwing him against the wall, his bicycle vaporized on the street outside. Then he said he didn't want to talk about it anymore, and he never did. His children respected his silence, though they wondered sometimes what else he'd experienced that day that he'd chosen not to share. By 1950, the bombing had effectively vanished from American consciousness. History textbooks mentioned it in passing, if at all, a footnote about anarchist violence in the early 20th century, overshadowed by larger events like World War I and the Great Depression. College students studying the 1920s learned about flappers and jazz and prohibition, but rarely about the bomb that had killed 38 people and wounded 400 more. The forgetting was so complete that when terrorists attacked the World Trade Center in 1993, many news reports described it as the first terrorist attack on a New York landmark, apparently unaware of or unconcerned with the precedent from 1920. The pockmarks on the Morgan building remained, though even those became subject to debate. Was the building really leaving them as a memorial? Or was Morgan simply cheap about maintenance? Different sources gave different explanations, and by the time anyone might have asked J.P. Morgan Jr. himself, he was dead. The building changed hands over the decades, was bought and sold and repurposed. The limestone facade with its hundreds of scars stayed intact, but the meaning of those scars was lost. They became architectural curiosities, interesting textures, the kind of detail that made old buildings feel authentically weathered. The violence that created them was forgotten. This forgetting wasn't unique to America, though the speed and completeness of it might have been distinctively American. Nations throughout history have chosen to forget their traumas, have decided that moving forward requires leaving certain memories behind. But the Wall Street bombing represented something more troubling than simple forgetting. It represented the failure of justice, the acceptance that some crimes would never be solved, some victims never avenged, some questions never answered. And by forgetting the bombing, America also forgot that failure, forgot the limits of law enforcement and investigation, forgot that determination and resources don't always lead to resolution. The few researchers who studied the bombing in later decades found the forgetting itself almost as interesting as the attack. Why did this particular tragedy disappear from memory, while others, Pearl Harbor, the Kennedy assassination, even smaller incidents, remained vivid in national consciousness? Part of the answer was the unsolved nature of the case. Resolved tragedies have closure, have villains to hate, and heroes to celebrate. Unsolved tragedies just have questions, and questions without answers are uncomfortable to contemplate for long. Better to forget, to move on, to focus on the problems that can be solved rather than dwelling on those that can't. But the forgetting came with costs. Each new generation of security officials had to relearn lessons that the 1920 bombing had already taught, that symbolic targets attract attackers, that preventing terrorism requires more than reactive investigation, that the damage from such attacks extends far beyond the immediate casualties. By forgetting the Wall Street bombing, America forgot its first encounter with modern terrorism and was forced to learn the same lessons again decades later, at Pearl Harbor, in Oklahoma City, on September 11, 2001. The forgetting had seemed merciful in the 1920s, a way to move past trauma. By the 2000s, it looked more like negligence, like a failure to learn from history because history had been allowed to disappear. The Wall Street bombing created templates we still use today. How we respond to terrorism, who we blame, how we balance security against freedom, how we forget. The explosion lasted seconds. The blast wave traveled at the speed of sound, but the changes it set in motion rippled forward for a century, reshaping American society in ways both visible and invisible, acknowledged and unacknowledged. Every security barrier around a federal building, every surveillance camera monitoring a public space, every enhanced screening procedure at airports, all of them trace their lineage back to that September afternoon when Wall Street learned it was vulnerable. The immediate policy changes were swift and sweeping. Within weeks of the bombing, armed guards appeared at federal buildings across the country. The Treasury Department, the Capitol, the White House, all received enhanced protection. Concrete barriers went up around sensitive facilities, creating buffer zones that would prevent vehicles from approaching too closely. The irony was lost on no one that these measures were implemented to prevent an attack that had already happened, that the horse and wagon were already burned and scattered across 6 city blocks. But security policy is always reactive, always preparing to prevent the last attack rather than anticipating the next one. The Palmer raids, which had been controversial before the bombing, gained renewed justification afterward. If anarchists could strike at the heart of American capitalism, then perhaps civil liberties were a luxury the nation couldn't afford. Attorney General Palmer, whose own home had been targeted in 1919, pushed for expanded powers to surveil, arrest, and deport suspected radicals. Congress, still reeling from the Wall Street attack, largely acquiesced. The Bureau of Investigation grew in size and authority. Wiretapping became routine. Mail interception expanded. Informants were recruited within immigrant communities, creating networks of surveillance that would persist for decades. The deportations intensified. Between 1920 and 1921, over 3,000 people were deported for suspected radical associations. Many had committed no crime beyond attending meetings or subscribing to anarchist newspapers. The legal standards for deportation were minimal. Mere membership in certain organizations could be grounds for removal, regardless of whether the individual had participated in or advocated for violence. Due process was a formality at best, an impediment at worst. The message was clear. America would not tolerate dissent that threatened the established order, even if that dissent was expressed only in words. The targeting of immigrant communities had consequences that extended far beyond those directly affected. Italian neighborhoods in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and other cities developed deep distrust of law enforcement. Parents warned their children not to speak freely, not to attend certain meetings, not to associate with anyone who might draw official attention. The social fabric of these communities was strained by suspicion. Who might be an informant? Who might betray neighbors to authorities? Who could be trusted with dangerous truths? This atmosphere of paranoia persisted long after the immediate crisis of the bombing had passed, shaping how Italian Americans related to government institutions for generations. But the bombing's legacy extended beyond surveillance and deportation. It fundamentally altered how Americans thought about public safety and acceptable risk. Before September 16, 1920, the idea that someone might drive a wagon full of explosives into a crowded intersection and detonate it seemed almost unimaginable. After, it seemed not just possible but likely. This shift in perception changed behavior in subtle but significant ways. People avoided crowds. They noticed unattended vehicles. They reported suspicious activity more readily. The bombing had created a population that was more vigilant, but also more fearful, more aware of threats, but also more willing to sacrifice privacy and liberty for security. The architectural legacy was equally profound. Buildings constructed after 1920 increasingly incorporated security features into their design. Setbacks from the street became standard, creating distance between vehicles and vulnerable facades. First-floor windows were positioned higher, beyond the reach of someone placing a bomb at street level. Underground parking was restricted or eliminated entirely at sensitive facilities. These design changes were presented as aesthetic choices or practical improvements, but their real purpose was defensive, making buildings harder to attack, creating physical barriers between the public and private spheres. The case itself became a cautionary tale within law enforcement circles, though not always in the ways investigators might have hoped. It demonstrated the limits of investigation, the frustration of having suspects but not evidence, theories but not proof. It showed how public pressure could distort investigative priorities, how the demand for arrests could lead to pursuing weak cases against innocent people. For future generations of detectives, the Wall Street bombing represented both a challenge, the perfect unsolved crime, and a warning about the dangers of certainty without evidence. In 2001, after September 11th, investigators reopened the Wall Street bombing file as part of a comprehensive review of historical terrorist attacks on American soil. They wanted to understand patterns, to see if past attacks could inform responses to future threats. The old evidence was examined with new technology. The bomb fragments were analyzed with techniques that hadn't existed in 1920. The explosive residue was subjected to chemical tests that could identify specific manufacturing processes, and they found something previous generations had missed. A pattern in the residue that suggested that dynamite had been manufactured by a specific company operating in Pennsylvania between 1918 and 1921. This discovery was simultaneously tantalizing and useless. Yes, they now knew where the dynamite had likely come from, but that company had sold thousands of cases to hundreds of customers during those years. Records from that era were incomplete at best, destroyed at worst. And everyone who could have been involved, the bomber, the manufacturer's employees, the customers who'd purchased dynamite, were all dead. The investigation had uncovered new information that would have been invaluable in 1920, but was merely historical curiosity in 2001. The case remained unsolved, would always remain unsolved, but now with slightly more detailed knowledge about exactly how unsolvable it was. The victims themselves had largely been forgotten by the time investigators reopened the file. Their names were recorded in official documents, but their stories had faded. Who was Catherine Larkin, the stenographer who vanished in the blast? What dreams had she nurtured? What life had she imagined for herself before a wagon full of dynamite erased her future? The record said she was 22, employed at a brokerage firm, had lived with her family in Brooklyn. But the person behind those facts, the human being with thoughts and hopes and fears, was gone. The bombing had killed her twice, once in the explosion, once in the forgetting. William Rooney, the guard who died when the Morgan Building's bronze doors blew inward, left behind a wife and 3 children. The youngest was 6 months old. J.P. Morgan provided a small pension, enough to keep the family from destitution, but not enough to replace the income Rooney had earned. His widow never remarried. She raised the children alone, worked as a seamstress, and died in 1951 without ever fully recovering from the loss. The bombing's casualties included not just those killed in the blast, but their families, their children who grew up without fathers, their spouses who spent decades with grief as a constant companion. The injured numbered over 400, but tracking their long-term outcomes proved difficult. Many recovered fully, returned to work, lived normal lives. Others bore permanent scars, missing limbs, damaged organs, psychological trauma that never fully healed. A few died years later from complications related to their injuries, deaths that were never officially attributed to the bombing but were caused by it nonetheless. One woman who'd been badly burned in the blast developed infections that recurred throughout her life, finally killing her in 1937. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as sepsis. He might as well have written Wall Street bombing, delayed effect. The economic impact was harder to quantify but no less real. Wall Street's temporary closure cost millions in lost trading revenue. Insurance claims from damaged buildings and injured workers ran into the tens of millions. Security improvements across the financial district required enormous investment. But these economic costs, while substantial, were ultimately absorbed. The market recovered. Buildings were repaired. Life went on. The human costs, 38 deaths, 400 injuries, thousands of traumatized witnesses, those couldn't be absorbed or recovered from. Those were permanent losses, irreplaceable subtractions from the sum of human potential. The bombing also influenced how future terrorist attacks would be perceived and remembered. Oklahoma City in 1995 shocked a nation that had largely forgotten domestic terrorism was possible. The attack on the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building killed 168 people, including 19 children. The response: massive investigation, swift capture of perpetrators, definitive justice, stood in stark contrast to the Wall Street bombing's unresolved conclusion. Timothy McVeigh was arrested, tried, convicted, and executed. The case was solved. Closure was achieved. The narrative had a clear beginning, middle, and end. But the template for the attack, the idea that a vehicle filled with explosives could devastate a building, that had been established 75 years earlier on Wall Street. September 11, 2001, brought terrorism back to New York in ways that made the 1920 bombing seem almost quaint by comparison. The scale was so much larger. Nearly 3,000 dead versus 38. The Twin Towers collapsing versus the Morgan Building's scarred facade. But survivors of the earlier attack, the few who were still alive, recognized the pattern. The shock, the smoke, the desperate search for survivors, the demand for answers and justice, they'd experienced all of it decades before. One elderly woman, interviewed in the aftermath of 9/11, said the towers falling felt like Wall Street happening again, only bigger, only worse, only with the whole world watching instead of just New York. The comparison highlighted both similarities and differences in how America responded to terrorism across the century. In 1920, the attack prompted deportations, surveillance of immigrant communities, and expansion of federal law enforcement powers. In 2001, the attack prompted the Patriot Act, surveillance of Muslim communities, and creation of the Department of Homeland Security. The tactics had evolved, the technology had advanced, but the fundamental response remained the same: sacrifice civil liberties for security, target communities associated with the attackers, expand government power to prevent future attacks. The Wall Street bombing had established precedents that would be followed for 100 years. But 2001 also represented a departure from 1920 in one crucial way. The attackers were identified, their organization was known, military action was taken in response. The Wall Street bombing had left Americans unsatisfied, frustrated by the lack of resolution. September 11th provided enemies to fight, wars to wage, a sense that action was being taken, even if that action's effectiveness remained debatable. The psychological need for response, for doing something rather than accepting powerlessness, had shaped American foreign policy for the following 2 decades. Would the response to 9/11 have been different if the Wall Street bombing had been solved? If Americans had learned that sometimes justice is impossible and acceptance is necessary? We'll never know. The physical memorial to the Wall Street bombing remains minimal, the pockmarks on the Morgan Building, still visible to anyone who knows where to look. A small plaque, installed in 1990, that notes the attack occurred, but provides little context. No monument, no museum, no annual remembrance ceremony. The 38 victims are remembered, if at all, by their descendants rather than by the nation. This stands in stark contrast to how later attacks have been memorialized. The Oklahoma City National Memorial, the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. The Wall Street bombing victims were denied not just justice but commemoration, forgotten twice over by a nation that preferred to look forward rather than back. Yet the bombing's shadow persists in ways both obvious and subtle. Every time a vehicle barrier prevents a truck from approaching a building, the bombing's legacy is present. Every time surveillance footage captures someone placing a package and walking away, investigators think of precedents like Wall Street. Every time a terrorist attack prompts calls for restricting immigration or expanding police powers, the debates echo arguments made in 1920. The forgetting was never complete. The lessons, such as they were, remained embedded in how America thinks about security and freedom, about acceptable risks and necessary precautions, about the price of safety in an uncertain world. Some mysteries are never solved, but the real mystery isn't who planted the bomb on Wall Street that September afternoon. It's why we forgot they did it. Why does a nation that obsessively documents its tragedies, that builds memorials to every significant loss, that teaches generation after generation about Pearl Harbor and the Kennedy assassination and September 11th, somehow let the Wall Street bombing slip through the cracks of collective memory? The answer says as much about America as the attack itself does. The evidence, such as it is, points most convincingly toward Mario Buda. His presence in New York in September 1920, his hasty departure 3 days after the bombing, his experience with explosives from construction work, his deep connections to the Galleanist anarchist movement, his friendship with Sacco and Vanzetti, whose arrests had enraged radical circles, the deathbed confession reported by an Italian priest in 1944. All of it circumstantial, none of it conclusive, but collectively painting a picture that's hard to ignore. If investigators had to bet on a single name, Buda would be it. But certainty and proof are different things. Even if Buda built and planted that bomb, did he act alone? The logistics of constructing a device that's sophisticated, transporting it into Manhattan, timing the attack to coincide with the lunch rush, all of that suggests planning and possibly collaboration. Were there others involved whose names never surfaced? Did someone provide the dynamite? Did someone else scout the location or confirm the timing? The anarchist movement's culture of secrecy means we may never know. Those who knew the truth either took it to their graves or kept it locked away, protected by loyalty to the cause and fear of prosecution. Alternative theories persist, though none carry the weight of evidence that the Buda hypothesis does. Could the bombing have been truly random, the act of a lone individual with no political motivation? Unlikely, given the target and timing. Could it have been a rival financial institution striking at Morgan? Possible but improbable, too risky and too brutal for business competition. Could it have been international actors, German or Soviet agents seeking to destabilize American capitalism? Again, possible, but unsupported by any concrete evidence. The simplest explanation: Italian anarchists seeking revenge and making a political statement, remains the most plausible. What we know for certain is limited but significant. We know a bomb was planted at 12:01 p.m. on September 16, 1920, at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets. We know it consisted of 100 pounds of dynamite and 500 pounds of cast-iron shrapnel. We know it killed 38 people and injured over 400. We know it was transported to the location in a horse-drawn wagon. We know the perpetrator or perpetrators were never caught, never prosecuted, never brought to justice. Everything beyond these facts is theory, speculation, educated guessing based on patterns and probabilities rather than definitive proof. The human cost was both immediate and enduring. 38 people died that day: clerks and messengers, businessmen and guards, a stenographer who was vaporized so completely that nothing remained to bury. Their deaths were violent, and sudden, the kind of ending that robs families not just of a loved one but of closure, of the chance to say goodbye, of any understanding of why. Catherine Larkin was 22. William Rooney was 43 with 3 children. Mary Herman survived but spent the rest of her life unable to speak about what she'd witnessed. These weren't statistics. They were people with dreams and families and futures that were erased in an explosion that lasted less than a second. The 400 injured carried their scars forward in different ways. Some bore physical evidence: lost limbs, damaged organs, burns that left permanent marks. Others carried psychological wounds that proved harder to heal. James Saul would flinch at loud noises for the rest of his life. William Joyce couldn't work in tall buildings anymore. Sarah Jackson never wore cream-colored clothing again, couldn't bear the reminder of the dress that had been soaked with her blood. These might seem like small things, personal quirks, but they were actually symptoms of trauma, manifestations of an experience so overwhelming that the mind and body never fully recovered. Modern forensics could potentially tell us more about the bomb if the evidence still existed in usable condition. Chemical analysis of explosive residue, microscopic examination of metal fragments, computer modeling of the blast pattern, all of these techniques could yield information that 1920s investigators simply couldn't access. But most of the physical evidence is gone, destroyed or lost in the intervening century. What remains is scattered across museums and archives, fragments of fragments, traces of a crime that can no longer be fully reconstructed. Even if we wanted to solve the case today, the tools we would need have been lost to time. The last living witness died in 2007. Margaret Wilson had been 5 years old on September 16, 1920, walking with her mother near Wall Street when the bomb exploded. She remembered the sound, a crack so loud it seemed to split the sky. She remembered her mother pulling her down, shielding her with her own body. She remembered the smoke, thick and black, that made breathing difficult. She remembered the screaming. For 87 years, she carried that memory, the child's perspective on an adult horror. When she died, the last direct connection to that moment vanished with her. Now, everyone who speaks of the Wall Street bombing speaks from history rather than memory, from research rather than experience. The question of why this matters, why we should remember an unsolved bombing from 1920, has multiple answers. On the simplest level, we owe it to the victims. They deserve to be remembered, to have their stories told, to not disappear into the void of forgotten history. Their deaths were not meaningless accidents but deliberate murders, and even without justice, they warrant acknowledgement. But the bombing matters beyond the individual victims. It represents America's first encounter with a form of terrorism that would become increasingly common. The large-scale attack on civilians designed to create fear and deliver a political message. Every lesson that America would eventually learn about preventing and responding to terrorism was available in the Wall Street bombing if anyone had paid attention. That symbolic targets attract attackers. That vehicle-based bombs can cause catastrophic damage. That investigating such attacks requires patience, resources, and willingness to accept that not every case can be solved. That the trauma extends far beyond the immediate casualties. That balancing security against civil liberties requires constant vigilance. All of these lessons were there in 1920, but the forgetting meant each subsequent generation had to relearn them, often at terrible cost. The pockmarks remain on the Morgan building. If you visit Wall Street today, if you know where to look, you can still see them. Hundreds of small scars in the limestone facade where metal fragments struck with enough force to chip stone. Most people walk past without noticing. Most guides don't mention them. They've become part of the building's texture, architectural details rather than evidence of violence. This physical forgetting mirrors the cultural forgetting, the way America incorporated the scars into its landscape, and then stopped seeing them as scars at all. 103 years after the explosion, the case file sits in a warehouse in Maryland, technically still open. Practically speaking, the investigation ended decades ago. The file contains thousands of pages, witness statements, investigative reports, photographs of evidence, theories about suspects. It contains the accumulated frustration of detectives who knew what had happened but couldn't prove who had done it. It contains the desperation of a nation that wanted answers and had to accept uncertainty instead. Someday, perhaps, someone will request access to those files, will dig through the yellowed papers and faded photographs, will try once more to solve the unsolvable. They will fail, as everyone before them has failed, but the attempt will matter nonetheless. Justice for the Wall Street bombing victims will never come. The perpetrators are dead, whoever they were. The possibility of prosecution died with them. But memory can serve as a form of justice, imperfect but meaningful. By remembering what happened, by telling the stories of those who died and those who survived, by refusing to let the bombing disappear completely into the fog of forgotten history, we honor the victims in the only way still available to us. We acknowledge their suffering. We recognize that their deaths mattered. We ensure that they are not forgotten twice. The clock struck 12:01 p.m. on September 16, 1920, and the world changed. Not dramatically, not obviously, but fundamentally. America learned it was vulnerable in ways it hadn't understood before. The financial district learned that power doesn't guarantee safety. The nation learned that some crimes resist solution, no matter how many resources are dedicated to solving them. And in the aftermath, in the forgetting and the remembering and the slow processing of what had happened, America began shaping the security state that would define the next century. Thanks for staying with this journey through one of America's most forgotten tragedies. The pockmarks on the Morgan building still catch the rain, still bear witness to that September afternoon when smoke filled the sky and blood stained the pavement, and 38 people died for reasons that were never fully explained or justified. There are so many stories like this, moments that shaped us, then slipped away into silence, waiting for someone to remember, to tell, to keep alive. I'll see you in the next one.